Restaurant Unstoppable. Inspire, empower, and transform the industry. All right, with excitement, allow me to introduce to you today's guest, founding partner and chairman of Helbraun and Levy, David Helbraun. David, are you feeling unstoppable today?
Oh, I don't know if unstoppable is the word, but I'm feeling pretty good.
Feeling something, right?
Yeah.
So today we're going to be covering basically how to negotiate a lease. We're going to be talking about how to speak to your landlord, the different types of terms you can negotiate. We're going to be talking about how to get yourself out of a lease if that is an issue you're faced with. But before we dive into that, I would love to get that motivational, inspirational ball rolling with a success quote or mantra. What do you got for us?
Well, I didn't have one, so I had to look one up on the internet. But I found one that I liked because I don't really have a mantra. But something that I related to was success is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. And that was Thomas Edison who said that. And I actually believe that is true. Everybody has an idea. Everybody you meet walking down the street's got an idea or two for you. And 1 out of every 100 can make it happen. And they make it happen because they work hard.
You know, and that's one of the reasons why one of our core values here is just showing up, because I really do think that's half the battle. And that's putting it lightly. Showing up, there's a lot more. It's a lot more difficult than it sounds. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's just showing up consistently over time. It reminds me of I can't remember the name of the person who said it, but it's just constant gentle pressure. Danny Meyer said constant gentle pressure. And I think that those words come to mind too. So, we're here to talk about negotiating leases, but I think it's really important for our listeners to get an idea of who we're talking to, why it's worth listening to the words you have to say. So why don't you just tell us a little bit more about who you are and why you're worth listening to?
Well, I'm 30 years in the restaurant industry. Plus, I used to own restaurants and cafes and coffee bars in Manhattan. So I'm a lifer. That was in the late 90s, early 2000s. As a second career, I opened up a law firm. There was law school in the middle there somewhere, but we don't have to go into that whole story. I opened up a law firm 16 years ago, and we cater exclusively to the hospitality industry. We're a 25-person law firm. We are the biggest law firm in the world that only handles hospitality. All of our clients are chefs, bar owners, retail, food people, big restaurant groups, etc.
What drew you to this vertical of hospitality? Why was this where you wanted to focus?
I think there's a certain personality type that's drawn to hospitality. Somebody who is an empathic person, someone who cares about other people, someone who likes being around other people.
Yeah. And I'm curious, in the work that you do, working with hospitality people, how much of your work is associated with just the lease negotiation part of it?
Well, it's a big part of opening up a restaurant.
Yeah.
It's one of the big first parts after raising the money is leases. So everybody who opens a restaurant has to go through it.
Did you have, what were some of you mentioned you were involved in the industry, Pyramid Coffee Company. What were some of the lessons that you picked up during that time that made you think maybe, there's definitely an opportunity here because of the issues that a restaurateur are faced with regarding legal issues? Do you have any horror stories associated with that?
I don't have any horror stories, but what I did see when I was an operator was that I had to have 3 lawyers to do my work for me. I had a real estate lawyer, I had a corporate lawyer, and I had a liquor license lawyer. And I would talk to all of them all the time, and it always frustrated me because they didn't understand who I was and what my pace was, and they didn't understand the industry. So as I was doing that, and I had a law degree in my pocket, I was started to think that there's got to be a place for a restaurant person in law, somebody who really understands what people who are in the industry have to go through every day in order to make their restaurants run.
Yeah. I think that there's plenty of people that can support that sentiment. So let's just get into it. Where does it make sense to start today's conversation?
Well, if we're talking about leases, I think we have to start with looking for spaces and how you do that, because people come to us all the time. So our firm opens up a couple of hundred new restaurants a year. And people come to us all the time and they say, I have an idea. I think I can raise the money And now how do I look for space? And here in New York City, there's a couple different ways to do it. One is you can just walk around, you can get a broker, but the kind of space you're looking for is what's important. And there are two different distinct kinds of spaces to look for. One of them is we call a white box, which is I find a space I like, it's got the square footage I want, the landlord's going to give it to me in a white box. I'm going to do everything that you need to do. I'm going to do the mechanics, the plumbing, the engineering, the whole thing, the whole build out. The other type of space to look for is called a key money restaurant, a key money deal. And that is where you find a space that is either going out of business or that has gone out of business that was a restaurant in the past. I have certain clients who will only do key money deals. And the reason why is because the place was built out for a restaurant. So your plumbing is there, your electric is there, your permits are possible, and you have so much more knowledge walking in as to what you can and can't do there.
Yeah, absolutely. We also call these turnkey operations where, I mean, one of the biggest challenges of getting involved in the restaurant industry is just the initial operating costs of getting started. Between the actual physical costs of the space, the equipment that you have to buy, the people you have to hire to consult to do it right, the permitting and all these things. If you can go into a space and just literally take over, when you have these clients that are taking over a space, are they rebranding it, or are they taking over a pre-existing business that has already been licensed and permitted?
Well, so they're taking over a place that was licensed and permitted, but they're only using those things for their new concept. So they're always starting a new restaurant, shutting down the old one, opening up a new one, putting some money into probably FF&E, certainly signage, and some upgrades.
So this is a lot of something we talk about on the show is if you're looking for a space, being able to turn into what you call key money or a turnkey operation. But when it comes to either just taking over a pre-existing business where you're literally buying the business from somebody and then trying to flip it and turn it around versus, okay, we're going to buy the shell of this business, but we're going to rebrand it, create a whole new entity. What are the pros and cons to that we should know about?
Well, we don't love taking over businesses that are failing. The reason why is usually they're in the shit, as we say in the industry, meaning that there's, they owe money to people, or there's a lawsuit out there, or they're failing for some reason. Mm-hmm. So no need to have a God complex to think that you can turn everything around. Better off going in with your own concept and opening up something new. It's a rare occasion that people can turn around a failing concept.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious about is whether or not the certain licensing and permitting is associated to the LLC or the business, whatever the entity is, or is it associated with a physical space?
Depends on where you are. Here in New York City, it's both. But it's really, when you do a key money deal, one of the reasons you do them in New York City is you can get what's called the temporary liquor license permit, meaning that you don't have to wait 6 to 8 months to get your liquor license, but in a matter of a month or two, you can get a temporary license because there was already a permit or a license at the space. So a big reason people do key money deals is to get that temporary permit so they can get operating sooner rather than later. Some states, it's to the person and you can transfer them like you can a taxi medallion. In other states, you can't transfer them. In New York, you can't sell them on an open market, for example.
Got it. What else do we need to consider when we're talking about white box versus key money?
I think the big consideration is how quickly and how you can open and how much less aggravation it is in a key money deal. Every time you go to a white box, there's 10 pain points that are going to give you agita and cause an ulcer. Getting gas in from the street, getting your contractors to show up, dealing with permits from the city, on and on and on. And every one of those things could be a disaster, meaning that it can delay you further and further down the line. So what you thought would be a 6-month build out period, and you'd be open in 6 months, can very easily turn to a year. And of course, when that happens, your funds start to dwindle. And it becomes a really difficult situation. And I've seen a lot of people go through it because you can't always predict what's going to happen with the city and the state and your contractors.
Got it.
So
go ahead.
Yeah. No, and so key money deals, there's just so much more certainty. And certainty is always in our favor as restaurateurs.
So, and I don't know if this is, I don't know if it's worth bringing to the conversation, but one of the things I have noticed in my interviews is that the folks that tend to go, as far as real estate goes, slightly outside of the heart of the city, on the outskirts, on the edges, tend to, and I don't know if you're focused solely on Manhattan or if you're in the boroughs too. I don't know how far you.
Yeah, we're all over New York City, all the boroughs.
So, is there some truth to that, where if you tend to focus on the outskirts, on the edge of development, right, there tends to be less hoops to jump through? The bigger the city, I've found, the more challenges you have to face, the more bureaucracy there is, the more roadblocks are likely to hit. That's a fair statement. No?
I think so. I think the big city is always difficult because when you're dealing, especially in Manhattan, you have block associations to deal with. And block associations are, your group of favorite NIMBYs, not in my backyards, we call them, NIMBYs who don't want any development on their block, and they certainly don't want another restaurant and another liquor license. So you run into a lot of that in the city, and the bureaucracy and the red tape's always a little thicker.
Yeah. You mentioned during our pre-interview chat online that you want to talk a little bit about using a broker. Do you want to get into that?
Well, using a broker is important, and you should find a broker, like actually all of your vendors, who understands restaurants. You should interview brokers and not just, take whoever is recommended to you. Make sure they understand the restaurant business. And a good broker will represent you and not the landlord. A lot of times people fall into the trap where they hire a broker and the broker is paid by the landlord. And ultimately, the broker just wants to make the deal to get the fee and does not really have your best interests at heart.
Okay, so when we go ahead.
So you got to be careful when you choose them, and you want to make sure that they understand restaurants. They've brokered restaurant deals, because there's so many things that are nuanced in our industry as far as a space goes, what the HVAC looks like, what the amperage is, on and on and on. And your broker needs to be able to talk to the landlord about that for you.
Yeah, I got to give a little shout out to my boy Kyle and Sarah. If you guys are looking for a restaurant broker, especially in the New York area, I will put you in contact with Kyle. Do you know Kyle by any chance?
What's his last name?
Kyle and Sarah?
No.
I have to introduce you. So when we are interviewing these brokers, what should that interview look like? What kind of questions should we be asking?
I would just keep it simple. Tell me how many restaurants you've done. Show me which ones. What do you look for in a restaurant? How would you represent me? How are you paid? Always understand how they're paid, because that will tell you who they're really representing.
Okay. Good advice.
And then, I'm sorry, one other thing is, depending on what you're looking for, if you're looking for a key money deal, you should only interview brokers who do key money deals. It's a specialty within the specialty.
So why is that?
It's just kind of how it happens. People create niches for themselves. So
basically, I don't think we need to go any deeper into that. As far as, let's see, we talked about make sure they're not working for the landlord. What are some of the immediate signs or shows or tells that they're working for the landlord, or not you, that the landlord suggests them?
Well, certainly that
would
be a tell. Just ask them who's paying them.
Gotcha.
Ask them who's paying them. And if the landlord is paying them, ask the broker how he's going to represent you.
Beautiful. Any other notes that we should bring to the conversation as far as when it comes to working with brokers before we move on?
I don't think so.
Where do you want to take the conversation? What do you think is significant to talk about next?
I think you should talk about once you find a space.
Okay.
What you're going to talk to the landlord about.
So once we do find the space, what do we want to talk to the landlord about?
First, let's understand who we're talking to and who is a landlord. In our universe, in the sea of hospitality, There's lots of different kinds of marine life. The landlord is the shark. Every single time the landlord is the shark. I don't care if it's your 80-year-old grandmother. She's a shark. A developer, he's a shark. They might be nice. They come in all stripes and colors. They're all sharks. So accept that and go into negotiations and talking to your landlords very carefully. Very carefully. So understand who you're dealing with. And then, in order to not be taken advantage of, you have to be able to speak some basic real estate language. You don't want to go see a space and say something that is just so out of left field that you're immediately labeled a newbie or a rookie.
Yeah.
You know, when you like talking to a restaurant person, right? You just know right away.
Yeah.
We speak a certain language. There's things we say. Same with real estate.
So when let's dial it back. You mentioned going into the conversation carefully. What are some of the things that aren't so obvious that we should not talk about? Like what does being careful look like in that example?
Being careful means having an idea of the things that you can negotiate on your own without having to go to a lawyer first. When you walk into a space, there are certain things that you should be thinking about. And I'll tell you what they are. The first thing you're going to walk around and understand is how much space you need. So in your business plan, you probably have a restaurant, let's call it, that's 2,500 square feet. When you walk into a space, you want to take a look at that and make sure it's 2,500 square feet, and then ask the landlord, is there a basement? Does that included in the rent? Before you start talking about anything else, get a lay of the land. Is there a roof? Can I use the outside? Can I put seating on the sidewalk? And you want to start to get a sense of what is possible. And so you'll ask those questions to a landlord. Make him describe his building to you. Make him describe his space to you.
So basically, you're just looking, it's like all physical attributes. Like you're just looking to learn as much about that space. You're looking to get information, not get information.
You don't want to give him anything at the beginning. You just want to get information. You're a shopper. Yeah. You're shopping around. You're looking at different spaces. So some of the things you want to know from the landlord are the typical things. The first thing certainly would be, what's the rent? And he'll tell you a rent, and you'll listen and you'll write it down. And then once you understand what's included in the rent, what space is included in the rent, you'll start talking about things like, well, what is the tax implications? We want to understand every dollar that's going to come out of our pocket. And it comes out in a lot of different ways. There's the rent, and then there's things called additional rent, which includes things like taxes, paying for waste removal. And you want to know everything that's going to be included in that, so you can walk out of that first meeting understanding generally how much it's going to cost you to rent a space there.
Can you give me any more examples of what would be considered additional rent, like taxes or waste removal, things that come up often?
Well, increase in tax is the big one. And oftentimes landlord will say, any increase in tax on the building tax, property tax, you're going to pay a percentage of. There are some buildings that are triple net lease, they're called, where you pay the landlord's increases in everything, in property tax, in insurance, whether it's fire, whether it's liability, whatever it is. And so you got to be really careful about that. But that's where you see the additional rent the most.
So during this first meeting, you're looking to collect data. Are you straight up asking, like, what additional fees are there associated? Like,
what else could I expect?
It's not inappropriate to ask those questions or anything like that.
Absolutely not. You need to know how much money's coming out of your pocket to understand if you can afford this space.
But as soon as you hear things like there is a triple net associated or increase in tax, there is an increase in tax, like, do you want to just kind of leave it at that, or do you want to kind of take that as a note and bring it to your lawyer so they can go and start negotiating on your behalf?
You can take it to your lawyer, to your broker, but you're just gathering information. There's your first visit there's no negotiation. It's information gathering. It's getting to know the landlord the same way the landlord's going to want to get to know you, by the way, and do a background check and check your credit. You want to do the same for a landlord. We had, I don't know, 300 clients during COVID fighting tooth and nail with their landlords. Some landlords were super cool about it. You don't have to pay rent or pay us a percentage rent. And some landlords were just the biggest assholes in the world. And if our clients did research before on the landlord, they would know who the assholes are. And
Yeah, I
the
mean,
way, yep.
well, I was thinking, like you said, you want to consider all landlords to be a shark, right? Because they're at the end of the day, they're a shark. But at the same time, if you go into a conversation defensive, can that hurt you?
You don't want to go in defensive. You don't want to, you want to see how you get along. It's a long relationship. In fact, it could be your longest relationship in business. You can be in business with your landlord for 10 or 15 years. And you actually are in business with them, meaning that you need to go to them for financial things. I need a break on the rent. I don't want to pay this increase. You shouldn't have billed me like this. I need you to fix something. They actually have a big part in your success or failure.
So I know a big part of what we're going to be talking about today is the basic real estate language, but you also want to talk about the landlord and how you speak to the landlord. So what makes more sense? Should we talk about how to speak to the landlord and then get into the language, or vice versa?
It's all part of the same conversation. When you walk into a building and you talk to the landlord, you want to ask him about what's included space-wise. You want to ask him what the HVAC looks like, and you have to understand what that is, because that's always going to be a big expense potentially. You want to ask him what the tax implications are for a tenant. Then you want to start asking him some more questions about basic terms, like what kind of increase per year are you looking at for your rent? We call it rent escalation. You should know that term. They're gonna, what's that?
What's reasonable? So we know if he gives us or she gives us a number that's extreme versus not, which is more reasonable.
Here in New York City, 3% is right in the pocket. 3% increase a year.
Okay.
So sometimes you'll see 2.5. That's rare. 3% is the norm. It's customary.
Got it. So what are some of these key real estate languages, these terms that we should be aware of?
Well, rent escalation is going to be number one.
Got it.
And then you're going to want to talk about what kind of build out time you're going to get. And landlords are always attuned to answering that question. If you take a space that's a white box and you know it's going to take you 4 months to build it out, you want to hear a landlord say, well, I'm ready to give you 4 months of rent abatement. And so that's the term, rent abatement. They're abating the rent for a certain amount of time to allow you to build it out. If you walk into a place and you say the words rent escalation and rent abatement, a landlord already knows that you're a serious person.
Yeah. So in regards to rent abatement, what is reasonable? Like we also don't want to ask for a year of rent abatement. That might not be a good way to start a business relationship. So what is reasonable?
Really depends on how much money you're going to put into the space, because if you put a lot of money into a space, you're improving the landlord's building. You're improving the space and increasing the value at the same time. So if you've got a space that you're going to put $1 million into, and it's going to include things like MEP, engineering things, plumbing things, et cetera, that the landlord's going to keep. Maybe it's a stack that goes to the roof. Maybe it's other ductwork. You should try to have that covered, meaning that the landlord should give you an abatement that at least equals the value that you're putting into the business. We usually ask our clients to tell us how long they think the build out's going to take, and then we add a couple of months to that, and that's what we're asking for.
So what is reasonable to be something that's expected to stay behind if your business doesn't work out, right? And you do close up shop, what should you expect to retain as your assets, and what would be an improvement on the physical space? I'm assuming one thing would be the hood, because you're not going to pull that out and take that with you, likely. What else?
The lease usually has a clause in it that says that any permanent fixtures remain. So anything that's permanent is going to stay. But also, the majority of our clients that end up closing end up selling their business in a key money deal because there's value to the stuff that's in there. They've built out a kitchen. They've got all that stuff you talked about. Might as well get a couple of bucks for it. But if you had to leave and your lease was over, and you would take your equipment, you'd take your furniture and fixtures that were not affixed, and you'd leave everything else.
So it's things like the hood, like the flooring that you're putting in, like the plumbing.
That stays.
That
all
stays. You're improving the physical space with that stuff, and that's part of the stuff that you're going to use for leverage in negotiating what type of rent abatement or what the period of rent abatement you can get.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now you got it.
See, I'm learning things, man. There's hope. Anything else that we want to talk about in regards to rent abatement or the language we should be using?
Not as far as rent abatement goes. Another question you're going to want to ask the landlord is, what's the term? So we don't say, how long is the lease? We say, what's the term? Which means, how long is the lease? Are you looking at 5 years, 10 years? We typically advise our clients that anything less than 10 years is a waste of time. And frankly, here in New York, the longer the lease, the better, because we'll always have a way out for you, an escape route. So landlords like to play games with term. They like to say, well, we'll give you a 5-year lease and a 5-year option. And you think, well, great, 5-year option. But it turns out that option is usually for the landlord. Or if it's for you, meaning you can option the next 5 years to stay there, they'll put in a term that says fair market value, meaning that I will let you stay another 5 years, but when you decide to do that, we're going to change the rent to a fair market value. What does that mean, do you think?
It means that they can change the rent whenever they want.
It means that at that point, because you've made the block cool with your funky restaurant or bar, and retail rents have gone up,
value, yeah,
they're going to raise your rent because the $5,000 a month you're paying now is $8,000. And so that's why we like to have a nice long lease with that 3% escalation every year. And I'd take a 100-year lease if I could. What
is a good, 10, you said nothing less than 10, but what's a good, reasonable target to aim for?
10 is in the pocket. 10 is where you want to be.
Is there a scenario
if you can get 10 with an option? That's fine too. If you can get 15, that's great.
Okay. What are some of the things we can do to increase our leverage in getting that 10 to 15 upfront?
Leverage in real estate only increases as your reputation increases. You want to show the landlord that you're a good bet, because restaurants are not always a good bet, and they're problematic tenants sometimes for landlords. It's hard to pay the rent. So if you're a restaurateur and you've got 4 or 5 restaurants behind you and you're a good operator and other landlords say good things about you, you're going to have a very different kind of discussion and negotiation with a landlord as if you're a first timer who is a GM at a restaurant and this is your first cafe.
Got it. So is there a scenario that you know of where it might be beneficial to have a shorter term?
Usually not.
Okay.
Usually not. The only short-term things that are okay sometimes are, seasonal rentals at a beach or something like that. But
the only thing I can think of is if you're betting on a location that might be hinging on something else happening, like a big commercial park might be built where you might get some of the flow, but if that park falls through or whatever, and then that space doesn't get developed, then you're stuck out in the middle of no man's land. So you might want an option to get out sooner than later. We're getting creative now.
You're a creative guy, Eric. I appreciate that about you. It does bring us to another point about leases. And this is going to also show that you know what you're talking about. and is an important thing to negotiate, and that is the guarantee. So most leases in this world, most commercial leases, require you as the person behind the company to personally guarantee a lease. So the lease is going to be in the name of your company, Cacciatore LLC, but Eric is going to have to sign on that lease to say that you guarantee that every dollar that's owed to the landlord will come out of your pocket if your company can't pay it.
Okay.
So as a restaurateur, that is a scary scenario.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to guarantee a lease for 10 years because who the hell knows what's going to happen? So what we do here in New York and in a lot of places, California is a little bit different, is we have something called the good guy guarantee. And a good guy guarantee means that I'm going to be a good guy if I'm failing and I want to leave, and the landlord's going to be a good guy and let me out of the lease. And it works like this. If I am failing and I want to close, if I give the landlord a certain amount of notice, usually somewhere between 3 and 6 months, and I write him a letter and I say, I'm closing in 3 months. I know I'm in year 2 of my 10-year lease, but I'm closing in 3 months. And you pay the landlord all the rent that's due up until that 3-month period. And you're caught up on everything. If that happens, you can hand the keys back to the landlord, and the landlord will rip up your personal guarantee. And you no longer have to personally guarantee anything. The landlord will keep your security deposit as a penalty and will market the space, and you'll both go on your way.
So to make sure I understand, as long as you are communicating, hey, like this is our intention, we're going to be, giving up on this space. Here's 3 months rent, and as long as you pay that month's rent, you're gonna lose your security deposit, but you won't be on the hook for the guarantee.
You got it. You won't be sued. You're not going to get a lawsuit that says, Eric, you owe us, $600,000 for the next 8 years. That's not going to happen. Yeah. So it's very important when you're negotiating a lease that you ask the landlord what kind of good guy guarantee he has. And he will start to tell you. He'll say, well, we do a good guy and we require 6 months notice. Take a note. We'll negotiate that. The shorter the notice, the better for us, obviously.
Got it. So I know one of the things we're going to be discussing today is what you should be talking about on your own and where the line's drawn where you start having the conversation with a lawyer involved. Have we crossed that line up to this point? Is this stuff that you want to have a lawyer involved with? The
other thing, well, I will say that your lawyer should be involved as soon as a term sheet is produced. So all of these little negotiations, these in-person, hey, what do you think? What do you think? Will result in what's called a term sheet. Sometimes it's called an LOI, a letter of intent. And that term sheet is the jumping point for negotiations. And the term sheet will list all of these things, what the rent is, how long of a lease it is, what the good guy guarantee notice period is. Can you assign the lease to somebody else if you want to sell it? What does that look like? We start talking about that too. What are your additional rent burdens? And all of the kind of major points of the lease are in the term sheet. As soon as you get a term sheet is when you should start talking to a lawyer, because you're agreeing to stuff that's going to show up in your lease.
So the term sheet is just basically like what to expect. So if you made it to that point and they're giving you a term sheet, this is the expectation of our business relationship. When you get that, then you show it to the lawyer.
It's more of an offer.
Okay.
So when you get a term sheet from the landlord, you're going to take that term sheet and you're going to use that as a starting point for negotiations. And so you might look at a term sheet that says rent is $10,000 a month and it's a 7-year lease and the escalations are 4% and the good guy notice is 120 days. And you might go back and say, I actually want the rent to be $8,000, not $10,000. I want it to be a 10-year lease. I want the escalation to be 3%, on and on. And you'll negotiate every single point in that term sheet until you all agree on it. And then once you all agree on that term sheet, we say, now you're going to lease. It's a big step.
Okay. Are there any other terms that we should be aware of before the lawyer gets involved? And I would imagine now we're going to start talking soon. We'll start talking about the different language that's involved thereafter the lawyer getting involved. Or
I think we've covered the basics. We've covered enough so you understand what a term sheet looks like. You should be able to look at a term sheet from your landlord and understand all the language and everything that's in there.
All right, we're back, and we're going to get into a little bit of how to set yourself up for exit. So get into that.
Well, always a sad moment.
Yeah.
When you have to think about closing your restaurant. But if you're in business and you're a business person, get used to it. It's going to happen. And you got to know how to do it and make sure that you have the ability to do it. Most of our clients who close their restaurant do so by selling it. And by selling it, a couple of things happen. It's really not about how much money you're going to get for it because you don't get that much. It's embarrassing how little you get for selling your restaurant. You may have put $1 million into a build out and you might get $100,000 for it. You might get less, but a couple of things happen. Number one, you get to assign the lease to a new person. So you're done with the guarantee. You don't have to worry about that. Also, the buyer is going to replenish the security deposit with the landlord and you get that back. So now we're starting to get some money. You got some money from the buyer. You got your 100,000. You had 6 months of security maybe, or 3 months of security. Maybe it's 15, 20 grand. That's going to come back to you. And you're going to be done. You're not going to have to deal with an angry landlord. He's not mad at you. There's no reason for him to sue you. You've actually found him a new tenant. The landlord's always going to have to approve that new buyer. And so you want to make sure that buyer has, the means to do the restaurant that they want to do and that the landlord's going to approve them. You also want to get the landlord's assent to this before you start looking. You want to tell the landlord, hey, I'm selling the restaurant. I'm going to come to you with a potential buyer, just giving you a heads up.
Yeah. That is an interesting point that you point out, that your restaurant itself, the business, unless the business and the brand that you've created is, scalable and shows tons of promise, really isn't worth that much. Most of the value in your restaurant is in the physical assets that you own, the space, if you own the space, but in this case, you're leasing in the actual equipment. And
yeah, I mean, there's just not that much value. That
if you're
the
failing,
value of a stove, that's a $10,000 stove goes down to, $1,000 the minute you take it out of the shop. That's just how it is. It's 5 cents on the dollar for equipment.
Which is one of the reasons why I'm sure you see most of the people in the restaurant industry, a lot of the really successful restaurateurs out there are really in the real estate game. They know that's where the money is, and they have a successful brand that they've created. And now they're just looking for real estate to scale and be. That's where the money is. I've seen.
I think if you want to be a successful restaurateur, you have to understand real estate. At least you don't have to become a crazy real estate person and be all about it, but you better understand it.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Any other things we should keep in mind as far as how to protect ourselves during the lease negotiation phase in exiting?
The other way to exit is through the good guy guarantee. You give notice to the landlord, you pay him what you're supposed to pay him. He rips up your personal guarantee. You take this company that you started that should not own anything else. It should be just for this restaurant. Don't mix and match. And you take that company and you close it. You legally close that company. So the landlord has no one to go after, and they won't. And you can walk away and have your shirt on your back.
So is that like a clause within the terms? Is it literally called good guy guarantee?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Or a personal guarantee, one of the two.
Anything we have not discussed up to this point that you want to drop on us to add value?
I think we've covered a lot.
So we do have a couple of folks that joined us today. And if you guys have questions, now's the time to get them out. Bob, you always have good questions. I'm going to open up the mic to you first. Anything that you were hoping would be discussed or questions that you're curious about, now's the time to get them out. I mean, you are muted right now.
No, the typical question would be my favorite topic, key money.
key money?
Yeah, David knows what I'm talking about.
What's the question, Bob?
The question is, I'm looking at a space, and the guy wants some insane amount of key money, and I just typically would say, no, you could keep all your stuff. I don't pay key money.
Yeah, I mean,
take your stuff out. Goodbye.
It depends on how much people are asking. If you see
well, you know
space,
as well as I do, it's some crazy number.
Not always.
So real quick, I want to backtrack for the idiots in the room like me. So we talked about white box space. We talked about key money being the turnkey operation, but specifically, what's the question you're asking in terms of key money? I'm not.
Well, you know, when you have the discussion prior to the value of stuff in a restaurant after you want to sell it, you know, most restaurateurs are delusional about the value of the stuff, but you know, you're lucky if you get 10%. But when they decide to hand it off to a new tenant, all of a sudden that's not 10% anymore. And you have to make a decision whether the FF&E that's there is worth your time, or does it, you know, correlate to what you're trying to accomplish, especially in the kitchen. And
yeah,
most of the time it's not.
Yeah. Take it from there.
Oftentimes restaurateurs are delusional. This is why having a broker who deals with key money deals is important, because ultimately the value of your restaurant is what the street is willing to pay for it. So if I've got a restaurant and I put it out there for $400,000, I'm not going to get any bites. But if I put it out there for 150, knowing that I'll probably end up settling for 100, and that's what every other restaurant in town is going for, then you have a shot.
Yeah, it also depends upon the location and the value of the property, and you know, what kind of traffic you have in the. I mean, for the city, it's, you know, if you've got a space in Union Square, you've got like traffic up to Yin Yang. If you got, you know, if you're in Alphabet City, it's a whole different value. I'm like David. I've been in this for a long time, and negotiated, you know, part of the negotiation of leases for years. And some of the line items, I mean, like anything else in a lease negotiation, is the same thing I tell clients for vendors. Every single thing is negotiable.
So back to your original question, there's somebody who is overvaluing their assets.
Right.
What's the question? How do I get this person to come down?
Yeah.
And the answer to that was get a broker involved.
The answer is a broker will tell you what other spaces are going for. So if I got a guy on East 5th Street who's asking for $400,000, and you bring a broker in, and the broker says, well, 2 things on this block sold over the last year, and a couple of things down the street, and they all sold for $100,000 with the same footprint, that's going to bring the seller down to earth. So that has to happen. You have to bring the seller down to earth. And usually, at least these days, it's a buyer's market. There's things for sale post-COVID.
All right, we're going to go to.
It's the same rule for even non-commercial real estate. It's got to do with the willingness of a buyer to pay a certain amount. And it's funny. It's always funny to me about real estate. It's like you can have 3 houses in a row, and one guy wants 600,000, and the guy has 300,000, the guy's 400,000, and it's in the same block. And it's funny that the value of what the market dictates by what your next door neighbor did, or what the area, the geographic area is, and it's all about willingness to pay. So if the market, you know, tends to say, no, we're doing COVID, it's a buyer's market, and we're not paying some insane $300,000 key money, reality hits the landlord real fast. Mm-hmm. And that number goes down like a rock. Because what you'll find out is that if you needed to replace that stuff, it's substantially lower than the key money.
Yeah. Thank you.
And it's new.
Thank you, Bob. Janae, the mic is yours.
Well, I was more just going to ask your opinion on something. All of this was super helpful and informative, and I appreciate your time. But I So about a year ago, almost now, probably more like 9 months ago, I decided to get into this restaurant thing. And so I went and talked to a landlord and, well, I talked to a broker. And then I went to a building space in downtown that I was really interested in. Found out who owned it through some connections and stuff, and went and talked to them, went and checked out the space, and have had some issues trying to, like, I don't know, tie anything down. Like, I've contacted the owner multiple times. We've just had issues like finding time to schedule, time to see it, and different things like that. And I've had my real estate broker has talked to them, contacted them, because I told them specifically that I was super interested in that space. And the broker came back to me and said that they weren't interested in leasing it, which is weird because I've also like talked to them more recently and they said, yes, it's still available. They just seem a little wishy-washy, which kind of worries me. So I guess I was asking an opinion, like your professional opinion on if that's just something I should maybe stay away from, or I guess any recommendations on how to go about that, because it is like literally the perfect spot and I love it. And that's probably also a problem that I've fallen in love with it. And this family that owns this building, they own lots of buildings in town, and it's been sitting vacant for like 2 years now. And so it's kind of obvious that they probably don't need the money since they've just been sitting on it and they're just not really eager to lease it, which is frustrating. So I don't know if I should just step away and be like, like, this is a business, like you should want my business like as much as I want to give you money. So yeah, just any opinions or thoughts on that?
You able to distill the question from that?
Yeah, no, I think that last thing you said, that attitude is the only attitude you have. You're not allowed to fall in love with spaces.
I know.
So we'll start there. There's no love with spaces, because you'll get your heart broken time and time again. I think you can tell a lot through the early stages of a relationship, like you can with any relationship. And if they're not talking to you, if they're not being communicative, well, that's what you can expect in the future. So I'd move on. Well, I just read that Clyde Commons available. That's a good spot.
Is that in Seattle or is that in Oregon? Wait, where's Clyde's Commons?
It's in Portland.
Or is it?
Yeah, but it's in the Ace Hotel.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really hard because I'm in a somewhat small town, and there just is not a lot of space available that I can find, and I definitely want a restaurant space to kind of go into, and there's just not anything available, so it's been tricky.
Sometimes we try to get directly to the landlords and not go through the broker. If you have anybody who knows them, sometimes a personal appeal will work. And you don't have, if it's a small town and you don't have a lot of options, you may have to kind of bite the bullet and try to get to the landlords, get them to know you. You're a nice person. Let them know you're a nice person.
Well, and that's who I've talked to, multiple times. And so, like I said, their family owns multiple businesses in town. And so the one person that I've been in contact with, she also runs her own business. So like, I know she's a busy lady, but I think I'm kind of getting to that point where I'm like, maybe I just need to start checking in, weekly and stopping in and bugging her about it. But I don't even know if she's the one that's really in charge of negotiating, like giving me the terms of all of that stuff. She just showed me the building once. But I haven't been able to get her to give me anyone else's contact information either. So.
Yeah, sometimes you have to do a lot of recon.
Yeah.
And what you just said, I think, is important too. And I can't remember where I heard this or read this, but a lot of what gets people to trust you is just familiarity. So the more you show up, the more you stay top of mind, the more you just are on their radar, the more familiar they become with you, the more that trust is going to grow. But you got to put the work in, right? So that constant gentle pressure again is coming into the conversation. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
David, I think that's, unless anybody has another question they want to ask before we wrap it up, speak now. 3, 2, 1. I think we're good to wrap it up. So how can we connect with you if we have further questions? If we need consultation, what's the best way to connect?
You should go to our website, Helbraun Levy, and it's .com. And you can send me an email, david@helbraunlevy.com. I'm always answering emails from people. If you have questions, feel free.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
I could recommend that if anybody wants to, David has a newsletter that he sends out. I get it all the time on the current condition of New York City, at least. And one quick question, David, what's the going square footage rate today?
The dollar amount?
Yeah.
It really depends on where.
Midtown. Midtown.
I don't even know, honestly. I'm.
Is it still in the 2 to 250 range?
It hasn't come down too much.
So Landy,
landlords
as you would say, Landy is still delusional.
Yeah, Landy's delusional.
David, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I really enjoyed this conversation. Tons of value. There is no questioning, my man. You are unstoppable.